Hello and welcome to Chillers and Thrillers, the paranormal podcast where I read true stories of people's encounters with the strange and unexplained. No comedy, skepticism, or true crime, just 100% true spooky tales. Before we get started, I just wanted to start with a quick note. This is our second to last episode of Season 2, but fear not, the podcast will return for Season 3 and the 1-year anniversary on August 15th. I'll continue to post shorter videos on YouTube between the end of this season and the start of Season 3, but as I prepare the stories for Season 3, I would love to hear from you. If you have any stories, theme ideas, or general feedback, please email me at chillersandthrillers@gmail.com, or if it's easier, leave me a comment on YouTube or Instagram. Also, I wanted to thank the user for France for the very kind review they left me in the App Store. It's so appreciated. If you'd like to support the podcast, the best way to do that would be to continue to listen, share with your paranormally inclined friends and family, or subscribe to the podcast on the YouTube channel. You can also buy me a coffee through the link in bio. Now let's get started with this episode. If I asked you to think about what would be one of the most haunted places in your city, what would come to mind? Perhaps a cemetery, a funeral home, or even a hospital. Hospitals are unique buildings because they are places where life both starts and ends. It can harbor incredible joy, but also the most intense grief you can imagine. So of course, it would be a place that would host a number of spirits and entities. In this episode, we're going to listen to stories of people who encountered a number of paranormal entities in hospitals. So turn down the lights, get comfortable, and listen in. The Little Girl, submitted by user rizzyroo. I would like to start this by saying that I am a very logical, down-to-earth person. I don't believe in ghosts or anything else intangible. However, I work nights on an oncology unit at a major Chicago hospital, and there have been some very strange things that have happened on our floor. There is one particular stretch of rooms on the north side of this unit where multiple dying patients have told us that they see a little girl in their room. Neither myself nor any of my coworkers have actually seen this girl, and working nights on a floor with lots of dying people can get sort of creepy anyways. But this really pushed it to a new level. During 1 week, we had 3 separate patients complain about her. One man, who granted was delirious at the time, was yelling and screaming at us to get that little girl away from him. He died within the hour. The next night, a woman in the next room said that she knew it was crazy, but she kept seeing a little girl in a pink dress reflected in the windows. This woman died 2 nights later. The night she died, a third patient in that stretch of rooms told us that a little girl in a pink dress kept grabbing his arm. He died the next day. Death always comes in 3s, and after that week, nobody complained about her again. All of this could be a crazy coincidence. Many people suffer hallucinations or delusions when they are near death, just usually not the same hallucinations and delusions as their neighbors. Either way, it's incredibly creepy, and we're all waiting for the next time a patient gets visited by the little girl in the pink dress. Tales from an ER laboratory, submitted by user Seabassy. My mom worked as an ER laboratory technician at a rural county hospital for over 30 years. My childhood bedtime stories were often about the weird, creepy, and outright scary things she had seen at that hospital. Some of them seriously scared the crap out of me, but I never told her the extent of my horror because I wanted to keep hearing the stories. This is one that stuck with me. My mom was in the middle of what would turn out to be a 20-plus hour shift. There had been an accident at a corn processing plant where a piece of factory equipment broke, and many workers inhaled a dangerous chemical that basically burned their lungs from the inside. My mom was tasked with taking blood samples from over a dozen workers, many of whom were writhing in pain and choking on spit-up blood. One man was very noticeable, as he wasn't wearing the same neon orange workplace t-shirt that everyone else had on. He had on a white t-shirt with Bart Simpson riding a skateboard, and seemed more alert and calm than the other men. He was also the only one not coughing up blood, but he did have a hoarse, throaty, irritated cough. My mom confirmed he was with the corn processing plant, and he said yes, then answered the rest of her questions while she drew his sample. For this story, we'll call him Bart. Back in the lab, my mom was in the centrifuge room, starting to process the blood samples. You have to pass through 2 other rooms to get to this room from the main lab area, and the path to get there would not be clear to a patient or visitor who has never been there before. While hunched over the centrifuge, my mom got a weird feeling and turned around to see Bart standing in the doorway, watching her. She dealt with her fair share of confused patients, so she asked if he needed something and offered to walk him back to the waiting room, where she had directed him originally after taking his blood sample. He nodded quietly, and she led him through the labyrinth of lab rooms, out into the main hallway, then across to the other set of double doors that go into the ER waiting room. She watched him push the doors open and walk into the waiting room, where she could see a sea of orange shirt-wearing men seated, coughing into handkerchiefs. Since this was a small county hospital, it was completely ordinary that many of these men would have to wait a while before being seen by a nurse or physician. My mom went back to the lab, navigated back to the centrifuge room, and loaded the next batch of samples. Later, when some tests were running that took longer and didn't need to be monitored, my mom went out for a smoke break. The break area was a walled-in courtyard, only accessible from 2 doors. One door was located in an administrator's office on the other side of the building, and the door my mom used was located in a back hallway behind the laboratory. You could only get to that hallway from inside the laboratory. So imagine my mom's surprise when she enters the courtyard from the lab hallway and sees Bart sitting on a bench along the brick wall. No one else is in the courtyard, even though my mom really had to smoke alone due to other people taking their breaks throughout the night shift. A bit amused and a bit irritated at this point, she sat on the bench along the opposite wall and lit her cigarette, trying to enjoy her momentary break without thinking about this guy. She didn't make eye contact, just focused on the Virginia Slim in her hand, taking long drags to try to get the nicotine in her system as quickly as possible so she could get back to work. When she finished, she put the cigarette out and looked up to see Bart sitting hunched over with his head in his hands. On her way to the door, my mom said, "Hello? Hey there, you can't be out here. Follow me and I'll take you back to the ER." Bart didn't move. My mom then asked, "Have you been discharged? Can you leave? Do you want me to call someone?" Bart very slowly raised his head, looked directly in her eyes, and slowly shook his head no. My mom responded, "No, you haven't been discharged? Then follow me back to the ER." She opened the door and held it open, waiting for him to get up. After a long, awkward pause, Bart finally stood up, walked past my mom, and through the door into the hallway. By the time my mom stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind her, she couldn't see Bart. She rushed up one direction of the hallway, then the other. She couldn't find him. She went into every laboratory room, turned every light on in the empty rooms, and couldn't find him. She went back to the centrifuge room. Nothing. So she left the laboratory and walked over to the ER waiting room, and he wasn't there either. She asked the ER front desk if she could check the 3 ER patient carrels in the triage area where patients would get assessed, either being admitted to the hospital, kept for more observation, or sent home. All 3 carrels were full, each having a coffee, blood-mouthed orange shirt factory worker in it. My mom asked the nurse if she saw Bart and described how he looked. No one had seen him. She then asked the 3 factory workers if they saw this guy, and they had no idea who she was talking about. She described how he looked, the skateboarding Bart Simpson t-shirt, the dry horse cough. They still denied knowing someone of that description. She ran back to the lab, cross-referenced the guy's real name, then asked the ER front desk to find his admission records. There weren't any. This was impossible because my mom's lab was dedicated solely to the ER, and no one would be referred to get their blood tested unless they were sent there by the ER. This was in the 90s, before today's electronic medical records, so it was feasible to misplace paper files or patient folders. If Bart wasn't an ER patient, how would he have gotten into so many behind-the-scenes, staff-only places like the centrifuge room and the courtyard? My mom spent the rest of her long shift keeping an eye out for Bart, but she never saw him again. In the days and weeks that followed, she even checked the newspaper for coverage about the factory accident, in case there was a picture of him or later an obituary. She never saw nor heard anything from or about Bart after that weird night. A few months later, my mom got to work at about 6 a.m. while it was still dark out. She parked her car in the employee section and saw a male nurse standing next to his car, putting scrubs on over his clothes. She thought she caught a glimpse of a white Bart Simpson t-shirt, skateboard and all. She hustled across the lot towards the nurse and realized it was someone she knew who worked at the hospital for a long time. She explained she knew this was a weird request, but could she see his t-shirt under his scrubs? He obliged, showed her the shirt, and it was the exact one Bart had been wearing that fateful night. My mom asked the nurse where he got the shirt, and he said he actually got it from the Lost and Found a few months before, after a shift where a patient's bloody vomit soaked through both his scrubs and the shirt he was wearing. My mom clarified, "You mean the night with the corn plant workers, everyone with the lung issues?" The nurse replied, "Yeah, exactly. Someone got me real good and I didn't have a change of clothes after I got cleaned up, so I raided the Lost and Found." My mom never figured out who Bart was, or how the t-shirt he was wearing got into the Lost and Found for this nurse to find the same night. Room 4, submitted by user dizzymisslizzy. Let me start this off by saying I graduated from nursing school in 2014 from the hospital that inspired a certain horror movie with Linda Blair. So right off the bat, I'm not new to ghostly experiences. Fresh out of school, I got my first real job in a fairly large hospital in a department that I honestly never thought I would work in. It was a 6-bed cardiac ICU with rooms that overlooked the city capitol building. It was a very nice unit, and I started out working 12-hour night shifts. The hospital I worked at had 4 other ICUs that were always full, so my unit always ended up being code bed, meaning if someone arrested or went downhill fast somewhere around the hospital, they came to us. I had been working there for a year, and I was no stranger to death. Each patient of mine who had died on my shift was usually already on their way out. Their families were by their side, the DNR order was signed, the funeral home was already picked out. It was rarely ever a surprise. In fact, the only time I was ever needed to do CPR on my shift, it was not even in my department. So I went on a nice long 2-week vacation, got engaged, and had a beautiful tan. On my first night back, I was receiving a report from the day charge nurse. She said she was off for a few days and to remind the next day charge nurse that the priest was coming in to bless room 4. I thought she was kidding at first, but she was serious. Apparently, while I was on vacation, every patient who was admitted to room 4 had died, and it was scheduled to be blessed. This came as no shock to me. People died often in our department, and it being a very religious institution, having a chaplain for every department almost, I just shook it off. Then, she said that room 4 was empty, and that it would serve as a code bed for the night. Around 2 in the morning, I get a call saying that they have someone to fill our open bed. The ICU downstairs was now going to be code bed, so we were getting our run-of-the-mill chest pain, take a look at in the morning kind of patient. Nothing to get excited about. We get the patient admitted and all settled into room 4. He was a gentleman of about 50 or so years old, very pleasant. His wife was with them, and she looked dead on her feet. I got her some warm blankets, took her to our waiting room that had cots so she could get some rest. Around 3:30 in the morning, I'm watching monitors and the camera in each room. All patients were fast asleep. The cameras all cycle through about 3 seconds each on one small TV we have on the desk. Room 1 was fine. Room 2 was fine. Room 3 was fine. Room 4, there was someone in there. It cycled too quickly for me to get a good look, and the doors to the unit were locked. Maybe the other nurse let his wife back in? I walked down the hall and glanced inside. There was nobody. I shrugged it off. It was late. I was tired. I was probably just seeing things. I went back to the desk and continued watching the screen. Room 1, Room 2, Room 3, Room 4. I was not imagining. There was someone there. The person was standing in the corner by the window, their figure completely draped in shadow. I could not move my body. It cycled through again. This time, it was closer to the patient's bed by maybe 2 or 3 feet. The hairs stood straight up on my neck. The next time it cycled through, it was even closer. It stood in the light coming from the hallway, but despite the light, it was still shrouded in darkness. It cycled through again. Room 1, Room 2, Room 3, Room 4, and it was right next to the bed. My heart started pounding and I could barely squeak to the nurse on the other side of the desk. As soon as my words formed and I was able to make some kind of noise to get her attention, the overhead system came on. A card is needed in CCU Room 4. People poured into the department. Doctors, nurses, pharmacists, respiratory therapists, they all rushed into the room. But I couldn't move. It cycled through the rooms again. Room 4 came up, and this time the lights were on. There were 10 to 15 people surrounding the bed doing CPR and slamming meds into his IV. Someone went to get his wife from the waiting room. But there it was, in the opposite corner again. A dark figure watching the scene play out. Just standing there. The man passed of a heart attack. Room 4 was blessed the next morning, right on schedule, and I put in my 2 weeks' notice. The White Door, submitted by Anonymous. I work in a very large hospital that had multiple buildings and big parking lots. Staff had to park in a lot that was a hike at best of times, and a pain in the you-know-what in bad weather. But at least the buildings were connected by an underground walkway. I started around 7 a.m. and got there early to avoid commuter traffic, which meant I was usually the first in the underground walkway alone after 6 a.m. Which meant I was usually in the underground walkway alone after 6 a.m. It was for sure over 400 feet long. The hallway had those metal doors at intervals with push bars, and glass that had metal grids in them, like schools have. Many times I'd be there before the maintenance staff, who would unlock the doors in the hallway, which meant I'd be blocked from getting to my workspace, and I'd have to wait in the hallway until they made the journey down the hall to unlock the doors. Otherwise, I'd have to go back to the beginning and walk upstairs through the hospital corridors. There were probably connecting ways to get upstairs, but I didn't know how. One time, I was in the underground hallway and walked into my workspace. I noticed a guy a couple of 100 feet in front of me, outside a huge white door. No idea where that led to. Hospitals have a ton of doors. I'm walking, and he's just standing there, facing the other wall. And in the blink of an eye, he's no longer standing there. Right in front of my view, he's gone. Okay, whatever, that was strange. There were no other doors right there he could have ducked into. I finally get to where he was standing and keep going onto my desk. Some days or weeks later, it's raining out, and one of my coworkers comes in wet. I asked her why she didn't take the lower hallway, and she says she won't walk down there because strange things have happened. I asked for more information, and she said she's worked there for years, and many workers have seen people standing there and then vanish in a blink of an eye outside the door. What door? I asked. The big white door? Yes, she says. That's the morgue door. And she's having none of that after seeing someone blinked out of existence as she was walking down that hallway. I casually asked other workers if that was the morgue door, and they confirmed. Yikes. But I kept using the hallway anyway. I wasn't going to walk in the rain or snow. Ghosts, get out of my way. I've got places to be and things to do. The Hall, submitted by user CherryBarGirl. There is a hall in the hospital where I work with a bit of an unsettling reputation. I first wandered by it over 30 years ago when I was about 10 while looking for the ICU waiting room. Back then, it served as a same-day surgical unit. It was in the evening and the hall was deserted. The lights were off, it was quiet. I was just a little girl, but I still remember how much it scared me. Later, when I started working at the hospital, I would visit that hall to borrow equipment or help take care of patients. Despite overhead fluorescent lighting, there's something shadowy and dirty about it. An anomaly in an otherwise pristine hospital. Today, 2 sets of double doors barricade the hall, making it a place that visitors don't accidentally stumble upon. Over the years, the hall has become home to many different units, from same-day surgery to an ER holding area to a chest pain unit. But nothing ever stays there permanently, and it has never been renovated. I bunked in one of the rooms on the hall for 2 nights during Hurricane Isaac. I felt so uneasy I had to take Benadryl to sleep. The thing that lives in the hall has been known to throw charts against the wall of the nurse's station. We always joke that one day we will figure out the charts fly as a result of a malfunctioning MRI machine. There have been reports of moaning and mists hanging in the hall. One of the patients' rooms in the hall has such a history of the paranormal that priests have blessed the room multiple times over the years in futile attempts to banish the thing. Its permanent resident appears to be a woman in a nightgown who can be seen routinely exiting the room and wandering down the hall to a window where she watches cars pass by before disappearing into thin air. One night, I was working on ICU and a nurse from the chest pain unit called us. She wanted to know if someone could float over to the hall and watch patients while she took an unstable patient to get a CT scan. I agreed and walked over. It was around midnight and very quiet. The hall was so dark compared to my unit. I felt like I had walked into a cave. I looked at the census board and saw that there were only 4 patients on the unit. Another nurse was in a patient waiting room administering medication. All I would have to do was answer the phone and babysit for about 30 minutes. I sat at the desk and signed into a computer. I asked my counterpart, who was going to the CT, if there was anything I needed to know about the patients on the unit. She said everyone was stable and left. I checked all the heart monitors. Everything seemed in order. I returned to surfing the web. From time to time, I would look down the hall, but it was empty. I assumed everyone was sleeping. Then, a heart monitor started alarming. It wasn't a big deal. Someone's heart rate had dipped into the low 50s while they were sleeping, and the alarm limits would have to be adjusted. As I started to look for the portable keyboard to change them, I saw someone leaving their room. It was a small woman in a nightgown and terry cloth slippers like my grandmother used to wear. She looked like the type who had smoked about a pack a day forever. She started towards the window, and I thought, Mama can't sleep because she needs a cigarette, and then went back to changing alarm settings. I looked for her a minute later, and she was gone. I assumed she went back to her room. The nurse came back from CT and gave me the all clear to leave. I looked at the patient board and I noticed all the names were outlined in blue, which meant all the patients in the hall were male. And the room that woman had shuffled out of was empty. I went back to my unit and sat there stunned for the next hour. I don't go over there to help out anymore. Rocking Mary, submitted by user No Recall. This is the story of what we called Rocking Mary. We closed room 12 in our MICU unit because just about every patient that has been there complains of seeing a woman wearing a white habit rocking back and forth by their bedside. Apparently, this nun never makes eye contact. She just stares out the window, which happens to be on the patient's left side over their head. This window overlooks the hospital cemetery, where nuns that have died are buried. Mary was a nun that died of a car accident outside the hospital back in the 1950s. She was only about 30 years old, and all the patients describe what they see as a young woman. We all thought it was something called sundown syndrome. Anyways, since then, room 12 became our storage unit, where no one goes in by themselves unless it's absolutely critical. Nurse Training, submitted by user banshee-of-reddit. In May of 2000, I started my nurse training and moved into an old hospital building that was formerly used as a morgue. The building was really creepy, and we all joked it was something out of The Shining. It had long, dark corridors, cold spots, and a constant feeling you were being watched. Despite the creepy feeling, I never experienced anything spooky for a while, mainly because I was working or socializing so much. 6 months in, I was having trouble sleeping one night because my room was so hot. I finally got to sleep but woke up about 2 a.m. because I felt icy cold. I covered myself up but had a terrible feeling of dread. I tried to push the sensation away, but after a minute, I felt like I was being held down by something ice cold. I was terrified but was too scared to look. The sensation of being held down lasted a minute and went away. The room suddenly became really hot again, and the feeling of dread disappeared. After a few minutes, the sensation came back even stronger, and I was pinned down again by something icy cold. When it lifted, I ran out of the bed and switched the light on, which stayed on for the rest of the night. I actually moved dorms after this, and nothing happened for a while. Sadly, I was asked to go back to the east side of the building while building work was carried out in my dorm. I subsequently experienced worse things, mainly knocking and scratching sounds in the early hours. The feeling of something jumping off my bed and also waking up to something scratching my back. I confided in my housemates who were equally terrified and experiencing similar things. A few people even reported waking up to seeing a young girl in their room. We all got so worked up that we slept in the same room for months. I eventually left to complete my final placement and was so relieved to see the back of that place. And that's all for this episode. Have you ever worked or stayed in a haunted hospital? And what are your theories on these stories? You know, I would love to hear from you. Our next episode is the season finale, so I hope you tune in. But in the meantime, I hope all you ghouls and ghosts stay safe, and thank you for listening.